Our last presenter is Brian Lucas. Brian is a psychologist, now at assistant professor in the organizational behavior group at INLR. He undergraduate degree in psychology from Bucknell, then a master's degree at Columbia in social organizational psychology. He moved to the Kellogg School at Northwestern, got his PhD in organizational behavior. He taught there, and he also was an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Chicago, the Booth School, which many of you know has had probably the first of all of the centers in decision research starting in the late 1970s. And of course, he had a chance to work there and talk with people like Dick Thaler and the whole decision group, behavioral economics and decision group at Chicago. Brian, welcome.
Thanks. Okay, now we appreciate. Right. So thank you for having me here to speak with you today. Today I want to talk to you about some of the research that I've been doing on the topic of creativity. So generally speaking, I consider myself an experimentalist. I take a lot of theory and the methodologies from social psychology, and I apply them to things, sometimes in social psychology, sometimes in organizational behavior. Generally speaking, I do two buckets of research, one on morality and ethics, and one on creativity, which is what I will talk to you about today. So to start off, I just want to throw out a definition here. So I'm defining creativity as the generation of ideas that are novel and appropriate for accomplishing a task or solving a problem. So it assumes there's a task out there, there's a problem that needs to be solved, and creativity is your ability to come up with solutions to those problems or ways of doing those tasks. And in this research, one of the first topics I got really interested in was persistence. And generally speaking, I approached this topic by asking two different questions. And the first question is, what do people believe about creativity? So what do people believe about the relationship between creativity and persistence? And then what is the reality of that relationship? So how does persistence actually influence creativity? And so just looking at the popular media and anecdotes, we see a lot of evidence here of how persistence is important for creative performance. So just to give a few of those examples, this is Pixar's movie Cars from 2006. It grossed over $100 million in the box office. It won Pixar a Golden Globe Award. But interestingly, this movie wasn't selected to actually move forward with until after they generated a pool of over 500 different pitch ideas. Similarly, we can think about Edison's light bulb. The light bulb that we know that made it to market was the result of over 1,600 different design ideas. And one of my favorite examples here is the Dyson vacuum cleaner. So the Dyson vacuum that we know today that revolutionized the industry was actually the 5,127th patent, the 5,127th attempt by James Dyson to create a new vacuum. And so the research question is here is, do people recognize the value of persistence for their own creative performance in their everyday life? So we designed a couple of studies to test this question. They're in this paper here. I'm only going to show you two of them today. Feel free to look at this paper or come up and ask me if you have questions about the details, which I will most likely not be able to get to in this talk. So for our first study, I went down to downtown Chicago and I recruited comedy performers and sketch writers from this big festival called Sketchfest. So these were people with about 7 years of experience and on average about 3 years of training. So these are aspiring professionals or actual professionals. So I had them do this exercise called a blackout. So this is a comedy sketch writing exercise where people are given the setup to a joke, and the goal is to just finish the setup with as many different endings as they can. So here's an example of one of those. So 4 people are laughing hysterically on stage, 2 of them high five, and everyone stops laughing immediately, and someone says blank. So the goal here is to finish that with as many different endings as you possibly can. Here just an example of a couple of the people generated. So here's the procedure that I put them through with this task. So I had them generate ideas for 4 minutes, so we'll call this the initial performance period. And then I stopped them and I had them predict how many more endings they thought they would generate had I asked them to continue working for an additional 4 minutes. So I got their prediction, and then I had them actually continue working on this task. So with this paradigm, we can take people's predictions and we can compare it to their actual performance on the task to see how they stack up. All right, so here on the x-axis, we have our predicted productivity and actual productivity. And what we see is whereas people predicted that they would generate about 5 additional endings while persisting on this task, they in fact generated about 6 additional endings. So they're significantly underestimating the value of persisting on this task for their performance. And so there are a couple of things that we could just point out, since I'm not going to show you the data of the other studies that show slightly larger effects. But one of the questions you can ask here is, okay, people are underestimating their productivity by about 1 idea. So how impactful is that? And so a couple things to say. So one is that we looked at the creativity of people's ideas across the task, and what we found is that the ideas that they generated while persisting were significantly more creative than the ideas they generated during that initial period. So in other words, persisting on the task led to the generation of their more creative ideas. And the other thing just to point out is that in many industries, including in comedy, a lot of times one good idea is the thing you need in order to break out. So for instance, in this domain, this sketch here, waiters who are disgusted by food, this is oftentimes considered the breakout moment for both Stephen Colbert and Stephen Carell in their careers. And just a little bit more data. So we had 9 studies in the whole paper, and then in the meta-analysis across studies, we had an effect size. It was about a medium-sized effect. All right, so the other reason that we think this is important, that people are underestimating the value of persistence, is because we think that it's actually going to influence whether or not people persist on these tasks. And so that's what we set out to study in the second study. And also we find a little bit of evidence of mechanism here. So in this study, we recruited people online, and we had them do an idea generation task where they imagined they worked for a charity organization, and they were coming up with ideas for how to increase donations from the local community. And for each idea they generated in the study, we paid them an additional 2 cents. So they were incentivized to be as productive as they possibly could. We used a procedure that was similar to the previous study. We had them generate ideas for 4 minutes. But next, we had them to report how disfluently they experienced the task. So essentially, how difficult did this task feel for you? How difficult did it feel to generate these ideas during the initial 4 minutes? And then we gave them a decision. So we told them, you can have an additional 4 minutes to continue generating ideas and continue making money on this task. But in order to get that 4 minutes, you have to buy it. You have to make an investment of 5 cents of your earnings so far in order to get that additional time. So we had people make that decision to either say, yes, I want to take the additional 4 minutes and pay the 5 cents, or no, I don't want to take that additional time, I want to keep my money. And by the way, the people that said no, they were filtered into a separate task, so it's not like they could just end the study early. But then regardless of the decision they made, we actually asked everyone to persist on this task and to do the additional 4 minutes. That way we could see how well the people who chose into the task performed, and we could see how well the people who chose out of the task would have performed. And so the first question is, how many chose to invest? So we see about 32% of the participants took the investment. They paid the money and they generated additional ideas. But then when we look at the whole pool of people who profited from their investment, that is, who generated enough ideas to make back their investment plus some, 79% of the participants in the study. So we see some evidence that about half of the people in the study were under-investing in persistence. That is, they chose not to persist on this task, yet had they chose to persist, they would have made more money. The next question we could ask is, what did disfluency do here? Was that playing a role in their investment decision? And we find some evidence that it is. So we find some evidence that the more difficult this task felt for people, the less likely they were to invest in that additional amount of time. And interestingly, we see that above and beyond their initial performance, which I'm using here as a proxy for the actual difficulty of the task. So it's not the actual difficulty of the task, but just how difficult it felt to them. So to summarize what I showed you here, people underestimate the value of persistence because creative work feels difficult, often which is a little bit dissociated from how difficult it actually is. And because of this, people tend to underinvest in opportunities to persist on these tasks. So this is just a small snapshot that I'm showing you of some of my studies here. I just wanted to also touch on some of the other projects that I'm doing that are in the same vein, so getting at what people believe about creativity. So in another paper I have with Lauren Nordgren, we're looking at people's predictions about how creativity unfolds over time. So if I bring you in and sit you down for an idea generation session, do you think your ideas are going to be most creative at the beginning? Do you think they'll be most creative at the end? Or maybe you think they'll stay the same throughout? And generally what we're finding is that people predict that their creativity is going to decline over the course of that idea generation session. But as I mentioned in the previous studies, when we look at their actual creativity, we see that it either increases over time or stays flat. So people are underestimating how creative their ideas are going to be over the course of the session. And we have some evidence for mechanism, and we coded the novelty and the usefulness of the ideas that people generated. And while we find that novelty does increase over time, we see a slight decline for usefulness, which suggests to us that when people are thinking about how creative they can be over time, they're really asking themselves the question, how useful are my ideas going to be over time? But when trying to generate a creative idea, that's not the best proxy for understanding that process. Some work with Nick Epley, we're looking at people's beliefs about brainstorming groups. So one of the strongest findings in the group brainstorming literature is that people prefer to generate their ideas in groups. They prefer to get a couple people around and generate ideas as opposed to doing it alone by themselves. So we were interested in the question of why, and if we do figure out why, is that correctly influencing the decisions they make? So essentially what we found is that people prefer generating ideas in groups because 1, they think it's more fun, and 2, they think they're going to be more productive. And of course, we know from the group brainstorming literature that one of those beliefs is accurate and one of those beliefs is inaccurate. So yes, it is more fun to generate ideas in groups, but you're not going to be more productive. In fact, you're going to be significantly less productive when you're generating ideas with other people. And so we did a study where we got people's predictions and their beliefs, and then we actually put them in groups of either 4, in pairs, or had them work by themselves. And what we find is that the pairs are actually the optimal sweet spot for balancing their goals. So people who work in pairs have just as much fun as people who work in larger groups, and people who work in pairs are almost as productive and almost as creative as the people working by themselves. So we're trying to coin this term brain pairing. We'll see if it crops up in the literature. And then finally, I want to talk about some work I'm doing with Drew Carton over at Wharton. So we're looking at how people generate vision statements, specifically how leaders generate vision statements for their organizations and their teams. And we did the qualitative literature review where we looked at the academic literature and also the practitioner literature on what people think they should be doing in order to generate vivid vision statements. And by vivid vision statements, I mean vision statements that contain words that can be seen and felt and sensed with all 5 senses, which other evidence shows that leads to more inspiration and it leads to more motivational vision statements. And what almost all of these things suggest is that you should focus on wordsmithing. So you should focus on inserting words that are clear to understand, or you should focus on words that are vivid. But what we find in our studies is that that advice is actually counterproductive, because when you focus on words, you're focused on communicating abstract meaning, as opposed to communicating in a way that's vivid and visual and could easily be imagined. And so we have this manipulation, which we call mental time travel, where it's essentially prospective episodic memory, but we have them imagine themselves in the future. We have them think about after their organization achieves its goal and what it actually looks like. We tell them, tell us what you see, tell us what you hear, tell us what you smell. And then after that, we tell them to write a vision statement for their organization. And the sense imagery that comes up through this manipulation kind of feeds into the things that they write, and it makes them more image-laden. And outside observers also rate them as more inspiring and more motivating. So these are just a couple examples of the different kinds of beliefs about creativity that I'm interested in and the ways that I'm testing them in the field. And so I wanted to close by just talking a little bit about why people might hold these inaccurate beliefs about creativity. And interestingly enough, this question was actually discussed quite in length all the way back in 1977 by Nisbet and Wilson. So their explanation here is that there's a lot of lower level cognitive processes that we lack introspective access to. So for instance, you lack introspective access into how you recall a memory. We know that we recall memories because we can articulate that, but we don't really know how it works. And creative processing is often the same way. So even when we're starting a discussion and we think it's going to go one way, all of a sudden we have thoughts that takes the direction in another way. And we also have a lot of trouble anticipating when and where we're going to come up with our creative insights. And because we lack this introspective access, we come up with theories and beliefs about how we think creativity works. And that's really the jumping off point for my research here, is that I want to take those beliefs and I want to test them against the best approximations of what we think actually increases creativity in the real world and look for the gaps, with the ultimate goal of helping people realize their creative potential and achieve their creative goals. Thank you. Also, shout out to the Expo Lab.
A couple of questions for Brian. Anyone? Anyone need help with their creativity? Valerie?
Really interesting. So novelty is clearly part of this. But the notion of brainstorming is to sort of get out the ideas that may or may not be useful, may or may not be appropriate, and so on. How much is this a question just running out of the less novel, the less original ideas to get to the more original ideas, and there may be some gold in there somewhere? How does novelty relate to this?
I think in one sense that's almost the definition of the process of how novelty comes about. Like when you just think about think about it just purely statistically, the first thing you come up with, just because we all have similar experiences, is probably going to be the first thing that other people come up with as well. And it's only after getting them out of the way and starting to go down your own independent trains of thought that you end up with those more novel ideas, which statistically could be labeled as novel just because of the fact that other people aren't thinking of them.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks to all the speakers. This is the workshop for BEDR. Every other week we meet. You are all welcome and invited. By the way, if you're not on the mailing list, but you got here anyway, come up, give me your name. We'll make sure you're on the mailing list. In the intervening weeks, the economics department has a behavioral economics workshop. You're welcome to come to that too. And let's one last time, thanks to all of our speakers.